unwanted, unloved, until a human gave her everything. In the gleaming city of Luminara, where perfection was not just valued but demanded, Ara had always been an anomaly. The towering spires of crystal and light reflected the flawless beauty of its citizens, each born with radiant auras, symmetrical features, and the blessed gifts of illumination. But Ara was different, marked by what the city deemed as flaws. Her skin bore faint scars that caught the light differently, creating shadows where there should have been radiance. Her eyes, though beautiful, shimmered with a dimmer glow than her peers. A slight limp in her walk served as a constant reminder that she didn't belong among the perfect. Every step through the pristine streets felt like an apology for existing. Her family, prominent members of Luminara's elite, treated her like a stain on their pristine reputation. "She'll never be one of us," her mother would whisper to guests, her voice thick with shame rather than maternal love. The words cut deeper than any physical wound. Her father's silence was equally devastating. His inability to even look at her spoke volumes about his disappointment. Ellen, her older sister, was perhaps the cruelest of all, openly calling Ara a shadow in the light whenever they crossed paths. School offered no refuge. Children would fall silent when she approached, their whispered conversations resuming once she passed. Teachers looked through her as if she were invisible, their expectations for her future as dim as they perceived. Her aura to be, "She's defective," they would say in hushed tones. No future among the shining ones. Ara learned to navigate life in the margins, keeping to the shadows where her differences felt less pronounced. She developed an intimate relationship with solitude, finding comfort in the quiet corners of the city where perfection's harsh light couldn't reach. Yet beneath her resigned exterior, a quiet fire burned, a desperate yearning to be loved, to be seen as more than just a collection of flaws. The weight of rejection had taught her to silence her dreams, to expect nothing more than tolerance from a world that demanded perfection. She had convinced herself that love was a luxury reserved for the radiant, the flawless, the worthy. But sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, she would allow herself to imagine what it might feel like to be cherished not despite her imperfections but because of her entire self. Little did she know that beyond the perfect facades and gleaming towers, in the forgotten corners of Luminara, someone waited who would see her scars not as flaws, but as stories of survival, her dimmer light not as deficiency, but as a unique beauty all her own. The afternoon rain fell in gentle sheets across Luminara, driving most citizens indoors to their climate-controlled towers. But Ara found solace in the rain. It was one of the few things in the city that didn't discriminate, falling on the perfect and imperfect alike. As she wandered through the outskirts away from the judgmental eyes of the city center, she discovered something extraordinary. Hidden beneath layers of wild vines and neglect stood an abandoned greenhouse. Its glass panels were cracked like spiderwebs, and nature had begun to reclaim it with determined persistence. Unlike everything else in Luminara, it was beautifully imperfect, forgotten by a city that only valued the new and flawless. Something about its broken beauty called to her, and she found herself drawn inside. The air was thick with the scent of earth and growing things. Sunlight filtered through the cracked glass, creating patterns of light and shadow that danced across the overgrown floor. And there, among the forgotten plants and broken machinery, she encountered someone who would change everything. Kian looked up from the old machine he was repairing, his hands stained with grease and soil. His clothes were simple, practical, nothing like the pristine garments favored by Luminara's elite. His face bore the honest marks of someone who worked with his hands, who found purpose in fixing what others had discarded. When he smiled at her, it was warm and genuine, without the calculated politeness she was accustomed to. "You're not like the others," he said gently, noticing her hesitation at the threshold. His voice held no judgment, only curiosity. "I'm defective," Ara replied softly, the word falling from her lips like a confession she'd been forced to make countless times. Kian paused in his work, really looking at her for the first time. "No such thing," he said, wiping the grease from his hands with a worn cloth. Everyone's got their cracks. What matters is what you do with them. The simple statement hit her like lightning. Here was someone who didn't see her scars as flaws to be hidden, her dimmer light as something shameful. Kian was different from anyone she'd ever met, an engineer and craftsman who repaired old machines that no one else cared about. He valued function over form, usefulness over appearance. For the first time in her life, Ara felt truly seen, not examined for her defects or pitied for her differences, but seen as a complete person worthy of attention and kindness. As they talked among the broken glass and thriving plants, she realized that this forgotten greenhouse had become a sanctuary, a place where imperfection was not just tolerated, but celebrated. Days turned into weeks, and Ara found herself returning to the greenhouse again and again. Each visit brought new discoveries, not just about the fascinating machines Kian worked on, but about herself. Under his patient guidance, she learned to repair gadgets that others had thrown away, finding joy in bringing discarded things back to life. Her hands, once sources of shame because they bore small scars, became instruments of creation and restoration. Kian never flinched at her imperfections. When she stumbled due to her limp, he simply offered his arm. When the light caught her scars, in ways that made her self-conscious, he would tell her they looked like constellations, unique patterns that made her beautiful. Slowly, she began to laugh again, a sound that had been absent from her life for so long. "You see differently than they do," she told him one afternoon as they worked side by side, repairing an old music box that would probably never play again. "I see what's really there," Kian replied, his fingers gentle as he adjusted a tiny gear. "Scars are just proof that you survived something. Your light might be different, but it's yours. That makes it perfect." Their bond deepened with each shared moment. In the greenhouse, surrounded by things that grew despite being broken, Ara discovered parts of herself she never knew existed. She had opinions, dreams, talents, all things that had been buried under years of being told she wasn't enough. Evening. As twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, Kian took her hands in his. The gesture was simple, but it felt revolutionary. No one had ever held her hands as if they were precious. "You're not defective to me," he said, his voice firm with conviction. "You're a treasure." Ara's heart swelled with emotions she didn't have words for. "But my family, my city, they'll never accept me." Kian's eyes brightened with determination. "Then we'll show them there's more to worth than perfection." Together, they began to envision a future where flaws were celebrated rather than hidden, where love wasn't conditional on meeting impossible standards. In that forgotten greenhouse, surrounded by broken things that still had purpose, they planted seeds of a revolution that would challenge everything Luminara believed about value and worth. The love growing between them was unlike anything either had known, not based on matching ideals of perfection, but on seeing and accepting each other completely. It was messy, imperfect, and absolutely beautiful. Word of Ara's relationship with Kian spread through Luminara like wildfire. In a city where information traveled as quickly as light itself, secrets were nearly impossible to keep. The news reached her family first, and their reaction was everything she had feared. "You're tainting the legacy of the light," Ellen spat when she confronted Ara at a mandatory city gathering. Her perfect features were twisted with disgust. "You're a disgrace not just to our family, but to everything Luminara stands for." The city council, composed of the most radiant citizens, summoned Ara to appear before them. The great hall was a monument to perfection, its walls lined with portraits of flawless ancestors and its floors polished to mirror brightness. Standing before them, Ara felt smaller than ever, but Kian's presence beside her gave her strength. "Your defective nature makes you unfit to live among us," the chief counselor announced, his voice echoing off the pristine walls. "You have brought shame upon our city by consorting with those beneath your station. You will leave Luminara immediately, or face permanent banishment." The ultimatum was clear. Abandon the first real love she had ever known, or lose everything she had ever called Farzim. It should have been an impossible choice, but Ara found herself surprised by her own clarity. "We won't run," Kian said quietly, his hand finding hers. "We'll fight this together." Their resistance sparked something unexpected. Others who had hidden their own imperfections began to emerge from the shadows. There was Marcus, whose aura flickered inconsistently. Elena, whose features weren't quite symmetrical. David, who had been born without the gift of light at all. One by one they stepped forward, drawn by Ara and Kian's courage to be themselves despite the consequences. The group they formed called themselves the Beautifully Broken, a coalition of those who had been deemed unworthy by Luminara's rigid standards. They met in secret in abandoned buildings and forgotten spaces, planning peaceful protests and acts of civil disobedience that would force the city to confront its own hypocrisy. Ara found herself becoming a leader, her voice growing, stronger with each gathering. The girl who had once hidden in shadows was now standing in the light, demanding to be seen. The revolution they started wasn't just about acceptance. It was about redefining what it meant to be whole, to be valuable, to be loved. The perfect city of Luminara was about to learn that its greatest strength might come from embracing its broken pieces. The movement grew beyond what anyone had imagined possible. Citizens who had spent years hiding perceived flaws began to step into the light, literally and figuratively. The Beautifully Broken organized peaceful demonstrations where they celebrated their differences, scars, limps, dimmer auras, and all the variations that made them human rather than perfect. Hélène initially sneered at the growing movement, but even she couldn't deny the power of change sweeping through Luminara. The city's gleaming towers, once symbols of unattainable perfection, now seemed cold and empty compared to the warmth radiating from those who embraced their authentic selves. The defining moment came when Ara was granted permission to address the full city council. Standing in the great hall where she had once felt so small, she found her voice and spoke with the authority of someone who had discovered her worth. "I am not defective," she declared, her words carrying to every corner of the pristine chamber. "I am whole. Every scar, every imperfection tells a story of survival, of strength. If perfection means denying our true selves, then I choose imperfection because love, real love, sees beyond the surface." The crowd fell silent, hanging on every word. Then, slowly, applause began to break out, first from the Beautifully Broken, then spreading to others who had been moved by her courage. The city's transformation wasn't immediate, but it was inevitable. The leaders, faced with undeniable evidence of the beauty found in diversity, began to soften their rigid stance. Laws were changed, policies revised, and slowly, Luminara became a place where difference was celebrated rather than shunned. Ara's own family underwent their own revolution. Her mother's coldness gradually melted into something resembling pride as she watched her daughter's strength and leadership. Even Ellen, once so cruel, eventually apologized, admitting that her pursuit of perfection had made her smaller, not greater. The wedding took place in the abandoned greenhouse where Ara and Kian first met. Wild vines served as decorations. Broken glass caught the light like crystals, and the guests were a beautiful mix of the formerly perfect and the proudly flawed. It was a celebration of love in its truest form, acceptance, growth, and the courage to be authentic. Years later, Ara stood before a new generation of children, telling them her story not as one of overcoming defects, but of discovering treasures. "You are not defined by what others say you lack," she told them, her voice warm with hard-won wisdom. "You are treasures, each one unique and perfect in your own way. Love yourself and love others for who they truly are." Kian stood beside her, still the same warm, steady presence who had first seen her worth in a forgotten greenhouse. Together, they had built a world where no one was deemed defective, because they had learned that love, true, unconditional love, was the greatest treasure of all. 5 years had passed since the revolution that transformed Luminara, and Ara found herself in a role she never could have imagined, director of the Center for Inclusive Excellence. The building itself was a symbol of change, constructed from both gleaming new materials and beautifully restored salvaged pieces. It stood as a testament to the value found in combining perfection with imperfection. Every morning, Ara would walk through the center's halls, watching children of all kinds learn together. Some bore visible differences like she once had, while others carried invisible struggles. All were treated with equal dignity and encouragement. The sight never failed to move her. These children would never know the isolation she had experienced, never doubt their worth because of how they looked or moved or learned. "You're crying again," Kian observed one morning, finding her standing in the doorway of a classroom where a girl with a pronounced stutter was confidently presenting her project about ancient machines. "Happy tears," Ara replied, leaning into his embrace. "I keep thinking about who I might have become if someone like her had existed when I was young." Their own relationship had only deepened with time. Marriage had brought new challenges, learning to merge two very different backgrounds, supporting each other through the demands of public life, and navigating the complexities of being symbols of change while still being human. But each obstacle had only strengthened their bond. The greenhouse where they'd first met had been transformed into their private sanctuary. On weekends, they would return there, working together on restoration projects and tending to the wild garden that had grown even more beautiful in its controlled chaos. It was there that Kian surprised her with news that would change everything once again. "The International Council of Cities has invited us to speak at their summit," he said, presenting the formal invitation with hands that still bore the calluses of his craft work. "They want to know how Luminara became a model for inclusive excellence." Ara studied the invitation, her mind racing with possibilities. Other cities struggled with the same rigid standards that had once oppressed her. If their story could help even one person in another place feel less alone, less defective, then sharing it would be worth any discomfort. "We'll need to be careful," she mused. "Our message isn't that perfection is wrong. It's that it's incomplete without embracing the full spectrum of human experience." That evening, as they planned their presentation in the greenhouse surrounded by plants that thrived in broken pots and machines that hummed despite their visible repairs, Ara realized that their love story had become something larger than themselves. It had become a blueprint for transformation, a proof that societies could evolve beyond their limiting beliefs. 10 years later, the greenhouse had become more than a sanctuary. It had become a pilgrimage site. People from across the world came to see the place where the Luminara revolution had begun, where two unlikely people had chosen love over conformity and changed the course of history. Ara and Kian, now in their 40s, had established the Beautiful Broken Foundation, which operated in 17 cities worldwide. Their work had evolved from local activism to global advocacy for inclusive societies. Yet despite their international recognition, they remained grounded in the simple truths they'd discovered in that overgrown greenhouse. "Do you ever miss it?" Kian asked one evening as they sat among the familiar vines, now silver-touched with age but still thriving. "The simplicity of when it was just us against the world?" Ara considered the question, watching the sunset paint, the cracked glass in shades of gold and amber. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but then I think about the letters we get, from the teenager in Neo-Tokyo who stopped hiding her birthmark, from the grandfather in New Geneva who finally learned to read at 70, from the little boy in Neo-Sydney who asked his teacher why everyone has to look the same." Their influence had rippled out in ways they never could have anticipated. The Luminara model was now studied in universities, implemented in schools, and referenced in international human rights legislation. But more importantly, it lived in the daily choices of individuals who had learned to see beauty in difference. The couple had chosen not to have children of their own, instead becoming surrogate parents to thousands through their foundation work. Every child who learned to embrace their uniqueness became their legacy. Every person who chose acceptance over judgment carried their message forward. "Look," Kian whispered, pointing to a corner of the greenhouse where two children were playing. A local girl with vitiligo and a visiting boy who used a wheelchair. They were completely absorbed in building something together from old machine parts, their differences irrelevant to their friendship. "That's it," Ara breathed. "That's what we were fighting for all along." As the stars began to appear through the greenhouse's patched roof, Ara reflected on the journey that had brought them here. She had started as a girl who believed herself broken, unworthy of love or acceptance. Through Kian's eyes, she had learned to see herself as whole. Through their shared struggle, they had helped others do the same. The scars on her skin had faded with time, but she kept them visible as reminders of where she'd come from. Her limp had improved with age and care, but she still walked with purpose rather than perfection. Her light, once deemed too dim, now illuminated the path for others seeking acceptance. In the end, their love story had become larger than romance. It had become a testament to the transformative power of seeing and being seen, of choosing courage over comfort, of building bridges instead of walls. The unwanted girl and the humble craftsman had indeed changed the world, one heart at a time, proving that the greatest revolutions begin not with grand gestures, but with the simple, radical act of loving someone exactly as they are.